Thanks so much for all the energy and support that we've had for our speakers from yesterday and the poster session. So real quick before we get started, can we give a round of applause to yesterday's speakers? And with that, I'd like to introduce our second keynote. This is someone whom I came of age in ecology at a time reading a bunch of papers by this Beschta guy and this Ripple guy and this Ripple guy and this Beschta guy. And they seem to have this fixation with wolves and aspen and willow and this place called Yellowstone. I mean, you may have heard of these things, but I almost think Bob doesn't really need much of an introduction because his work speaks for itself and he's got a very large body of it. Bob recently retired from Forest Ecosystems and Society. He's an emeritus professor at Oregon State University in Corvallis, and we're very, very fortunate to have him. Let's welcome Bob.
Thank you, Nate, and it certainly is a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the symposium. It's been great listening to the talks the last several days. I first saw Yellowstone in 1997. I was I'm sorry, not 97, 65, going back in time. As a fresh graduate out of Colorado State University coming to Utah State to work on a master's program. And I'd been back to Yellowstone many times, but it wasn't really until 96 that I actually walked into the winter range of Yellowstone National Park, which we see on the board here. And I was a little bit flabbergasted at what I saw. I mean, I saw riparian systems without any shrubs, without any willows, without any young cottonwoods. I saw stream banks eroding. I saw a very wide and braided river. And I just saw an ecosystem I thought was on a very much of a downward trend, and I didn't totally understand why. And it wasn't until 2001 that I had a chance to go back and begin to do research in the park and begin to help put some pieces together. And since then, have been going back just about every year because it's a really, really fun and interesting place to work. Before I get very far, though, I'd like to mention the Bill Ripple component. Much of what I have done and worked on in the last 10, 12 years has involved Bill also. He's been very much a component of the research and some of the results that we're going to see this morning. I'd also like to acknowledge what early park biologists did and saw and observed and recorded. Much of that record, which gets buried in time, but if you go back and look at it, these folks saw what was happening when their systems were changing. And their observations were actually very crucial, and the photographs they took were crucial to us trying to figure out the history of Yellowstone as well as several other parks. And lastly, Charles Kay, one of the locals. Charles has done some really outstanding work on herbivory in Yellowstone and the effects of ungulates. He's also worked in places like Utah, of course, and Nevada, and he's done some really important work, which again is a foundation for some of what you're going to see today. So, where am I going to take you? Four things. I'm going to look historically. I think it's crucial to go back in time a little bit, understand how Yellowstone got to where it was. I'd like to then step outside of Yellowstone briefly, look at some other places in the West, and then we'll come back to Yellowstone and bring it up to the present, and then some parting thoughts. So we all know where Yellowstone is, this corner of Wyoming, which also a little bit of Montana and Idaho, but mostly in Wyoming. But the place of interest is this thing called the Northern Winter Range. And here's the park boundary right here. Montana's above, Wyoming here. And this is the part of the winter range which is inside the park. Elk summer in areas around there come into this in the fall and spend their winter months foraging in there, getting through winters and back into the summer range. And it's been an area of much interest for many years for many people. Butte Creek sits right over in here. Lamar River sits here. Black-tailed Deer Plateau sits over here. There'll be some names we will come into. So, first part of my talk. Loss of wolves, Canis lupus, disappeared from the park. Just didn't disappear, actually, it was extirpated. It was taken, it was an intentional process of removing this predator from the park. And it became part of what I would consider to be Yellowstone's experiment in time with regard to large predators. It wasn't an intentional experiment, and it was what we were doing across the West. Wolves were disappearing everywhere intentionally by human actions. We were poisoning them, trapping them, doing whatever it took to get rid of them. So gray wolves disappeared in the mid-1920s, And this is where the biologists began to notice strange things were starting to happen inside the park fairly quickly. That is, vegetation was beginning to get browsed at levels they had never seen before. You know, it just started encroaching on vegetation. And if we come forward a little bit from the 1920s, half a century later, and we look at the Lamar Valley, 1970s roughly, here we have some old cottonwoods, but no little cottonwoods. Here we have some remnant willows, but they're not doing very well. They're being heavily browsed. And for those of you that are biologists in the group, look at the vigilance levels of the elk. This is midwinter, and they could care less that there's a photographer or somebody standing around watching what they're doing. This is not what elk look like in Yellowstone today. It's an entirely different ballgame. But this is what they looked like in the 70s and what they were doing. If we looked at aspen, there was a lot of interest in aspen. There was more interest in aspen at the time than there was on willows and cottonwoods. People were concerned to some degree. Here's a photograph, an air photograph in 1954 showing a large aspen stand along the Lamar River, looking down on this. And in 1992, you can see there are remnant trees, but the vast majority of that stand has already disappeared. So there's this downward trend in aspen, this decline in aspen taking place, and people were questioning why. And if you'd have stood in this stand in 1954, you'd have known it was already in trouble. Okay, you didn't have to wait until 1992. Because these aspen stands, the overstories that are left, we were seeing no young plants coming in. Okay, so we were getting this recruitment gap, or these missing age classes in these aspen stands taking place over time. And so today we're left with these overstory aspen stands which are on their way out. And this is some data which Eric Larson was willing to share with me. He sent it to me actually a day and a half ago. I just put it in. This is some mortality data that Eric's been collecting over about a 10-year period in the Northern Range. Eric did his PhD looking at aspen in the Northern Range at a bunch of aspen stands. And on his plots originally he had something like 200 overstory aspen. Not a large sample, but it's across many plots, okay? Over time, you can see what the trend is. And by 2009, the last data point I have, he's lost over half of his overstory aspen. And you can project the trend. So we're on a downward trend on overstory aspen in Yellowstone, and nothing's going to change that. That's what's on its way. So when I began to work in the park, the question I had, and I started working with cottonwoods, and the question was, well, how old are cottonwoods, and when did the decline really begin? What can we figure out about this decline business and causative factors attributing to the decline? And Eric had been working with aspen. Eric and Larson and Bill Ripple had been working with aspen, and so they were looking at some very similar kinds of questions. So here's this overstory, an understory, but nothing in between, overstory, and again, no young ones. So some dramatic changes in plant communities have been taking place. So very simply what was done was collection of some field data that is pretty basic in a way. Use a diameter tape or some measure of tree diameter. Using increment cores, we get a core where we can age the tree. And so we end up with a diameter, a measure of the dimensions, how big that tree is. We know the age. We get a relationship between age and diameter. And now we can walk across the Northern Range and walk up to a tree, measure its diameter, and estimate its age. Okay, and so that's what we're doing. And the Park Service, of course, would not allow us to core every tree anyways. So we needed this shortcut method, but it allowed us now to measure a large number of trees. So if you do that in Yellowstone and plot the data, you end up with this thing called age structure. And it's very simply plotting a number of trees versus when did they establish. And we bin these here by 10-year increments. So if we look at aspen, we end up showing that there's nothing out here more than 150 years old. We go back, by the way, this goes from the present, roughly 2000, back 250 years to 1750. So aspen don't grow much beyond 150, so we would not expect any trees older than out in here. As we come to the present, notice increasing numbers of trees. And this is what we'd expect in uneven age forest stands over time, that as we come to the present, we should see lots and lots of younger and younger trees by dates of establishment. So this is expected. So what the observations, though, show we're missing those. That is, we only have a few trees here, and basically we end up then with missing age classes of trees. The cottonwood record goes back further. We can go back 250 years. We can go back to the time. We can go back to the time of Lewis and Clark right here in 1805. And notice that cottonwood are doing everything just fine for over 150 years, and then we get to this point right from here, and we see this incredible drop-off, and we go to essentially zero in both cases with regard to recruitment of aspen and cottonwood in the northern range. This is a very severe treatment to an ecosystem to bring recruitment down to these kinds of levels, okay? And the thing that ultimately popped out of our data sets was the correspondence between the presence of wolves and the absence of wolves. The timing isn't perfect, but the very last wolves disappeared in here. Functionally, they could have been gone in the previous decade or two. You know, it's hard to understand the functional, you know, when wolves functionally disappeared in Yellowstone National Park. All we know is the very last wolves disappeared where the blue line is at. So we draw a line there with the blue line, and that's our approximation of when wolves disappeared. Imperfect. But notice what happens to the right of the curve. Okay? So things are missing. So the long and the short, of course, is a story that's been told before. In the absence of wolves, unrestricted ungulate herbivory had major impacts to riparian plant communities, to food webs, and to ecosystem processes. Okay, and it's a story that we have told before, but again, I just want to bring everybody up to speed. So, is Yellowstone a unique little story, or what happens if we wander across the West and look at other national parks? You know, and they have also saw apex predators disappear. So we can ask the question and see if there are replicates to this particular story. And we're going to do that, but in a very quick way. But one of the questions might be is why use national parks? Is this just a park story? Well, I believe it's bigger than a park story, but there's good reason scientifically or from a research standpoint for using parks. They all had predators present and then either extirpation or displaced inside the parks. They all have a presence of long-lived browse species. There's an availability of historical reports and photographs. Again, early Park Service biologists were really good at seeing what was going on, and they kept track. Parks also occur in different biomes, and these are pretty large on the landscape. They are landscape entities. Yellowstone is a pretty large feature. The potentially confounding effects of alternative land uses are generally either minimized or absent. We do have roads in Yellowstone, but we don't have them at high densities. We don't have grazing in Yellowstone. We don't have forestry in Yellowstone. Okay, so some of these alternative land uses are not part of the issue generally. We have free-flowing streams, no dams. So this is really great for riparian ecosystems because we don't have to worry about now the impact of a dam in the system and its influence on what happens in riparian ecosystems. And in some cases, we may have spatial controls. That is either refugia sites from browsing or exclosures, ungulate exclosures. And these become incredibly important, too, for trying to understand what's happening. So where'd we go? Well, we took a national park tour. We were in Yellowstone. We ended up going to Olympic, Yosemite, Zion, Wind Cave National Park in South Dakota. We also went to Jasper, and there's also been work by Canadians in Banff National Park also. So there's been a bunch of work done in the recent decade. I'm going to summarize these results very quickly here. And again, what we're looking at is age structure. Remember back a few slides, I was looking at age structure. This is Yellowstone here, and it happens to be cottonwoods. So here's cottonwoods coming up to the present. In this case, I'm only going back 150 years though. Okay, so here it is, coming to the present. Wolves disappear, we see a drop off, and all of a sudden we see a little bump up. So Yellowstone is unique in comparison to the rest of those because Yellowstone brought wolves back. Something different began to happen here, but notice the downturn. Let's go to Olympic. Olympic is where I live, in essence, in the Pacific Northwest. These are these rainforests, highly productive rainforests, and to think that ungulates could stop reproduction and recruitment of woody species there is something that I really had never contemplated. But look at what happened in Olympic National Park. Wolves are present, and the blue line shows when they disappeared. Cottonwood recruitment was doing just fine, then essentially crashed. Big leaf maple in Olympic. Same story, different species. The ecology of these two tree species is incredibly different. Big leaf maple is a very slow-growing understory plant that hangs around, and finally when an opening occurs, up it goes. Black cottonwood, on the other hand, requires bare substrates and then kind of explodes out of the ground when it gets a chance and creates these riparian thickets of cottonwood. Totally different, and yet look at the signature. Same signatures occurring. We went to Yosemite. Now this is a cougar mule deer system. This is a wolf elk system up above here, Olympic elk. Here we have cougar mule deer. California black oak was our key species. They were doing just fine. Mule deer got displaced, and then we saw this drop off. Yellowstone we've looked at. This is Zion National Park. We're looking at Fremont Cottonwood. Cougar were displaced because of tourists in the canyon, and again we see a drop off in recruitment, a crash taking place. And our last case here is Wind Cave National Park. It's a more complicated story here, but the entire predator guild disappeared at this particular point in time. We had cattle in the system. Now we got elk and we have bison in that system. And so Plains Cottonwood is in tough shape. And if we look at what pictures, what is represented by those graphs, just pictorially, these two up here are Olympic. Here's black cottonwood, and you can see a kind of a grass prairie underneath here, and here is big leaf maple with a fern prairie working here. This is the California black oak in this case. Again, big trees in all instances, no intermediate size classes, no young ones. Recruitment is essentially being shut down by herbivory, and it's being shut down over an incredibly long period of time. Cottonwoods on the Lamar, eroding banks. Fremont Cottonwood on the banks here, no little ones, and notice the incredible erosion occurring in Zion Canyon. If you ever go to Zion Canyon, go there and marvel at the geology, but then when you look down in the canyon bottom, you're going to see a different story. Okay, it's just an ecological disaster in a way. And finally, we have Plains Cottonwood, and you can see the remnant old Plains Cottonwood, and they are on their way out. They'll hang around for another 50, 100 years maybe, but no recruitment occurring. So that's the story. We tried to summarize that in one graph and fit a model to it. Our model was expected and observed establishment of trees, and we see here during our fitting of the curve, this is what we get. And then when we look at the expected versus observed, we see this incredible drop-off. And within 20 years after the loss of an apex predator, we see a 90% drop in recruitment from expected. We're down to 10% left. Within a half a century, we have a 99% drop-off. We're down to 1%. Essentially, we're down to zero. Okay, we've lost all recruitment from those systems. So that's just a generic look at a whole series of national parks where all we did was pull an apex predator out of the system. We tried to look at alternative hypotheses that might explain these effects, and we looked at climate, we looked at fire, and we looked at peak flows, and we looked at climate, and we looked at land use, and we looked at climate, and we looked at human interventions. And in all cases, nothing came to the surface saying, this really explains what's going on out there. It always was herbivory, and it was always consistent with early Park Service biologists and their observations as to what was happening in the ecosystem. So that kind of brings us to the present. We've got some parks that are in distress, and Yellowstone happened to be one of those. But since we did that work, that historical reconstruction, we've been working in Yellowstone and asking the question, well, what about what's happening with reintroduction? Wolves came back into the park 95, 96, 97. So we're looking at now at almost 2 decades since wolves were reintroduced into the park. The very first wolf cage, these wolves came out of Alberta, transported down in cages, released into the park, but in this case, they were carried by a cage over to holding pens. They were in these holding pens for a month or so to get acclimated to the sights and sounds of Yellowstone. So the concern was if they did a hard release, just turn them loose, they'd go right back to Alberta. But they did what they call a soft release. They kept them in those pens for a month or so, and then these wolves were released into the park. And they very quickly began to do what wolves need to do. These are carnivores. They require meat. In this case, Rocky Mountain elk, plenty of them in northern Yellowstone at the time. And it must have been some pretty interesting encounters at first. Here we have 10, 12,000 elk, never having seen a wolf before. You know? Were these naive elk? Probably. Did they quickly learn that these were not big coyotes? Probably. All right, so something different was in the system. Wolves are back. After 7 decades of absence, wolves are back. And very quickly, carrion started showing up on the landscape. And this has implications for other large carnivores, such as bears, also for scavengers and other species. Okay, but this is what began to happen. So as we look at Yellowstone from a trophic cascades perspective, that is, the trophic levels, what's going on, Yellowstone, in the absence of wolves, we had top-down forcing by elk. Herbivory was suppressing plant communities. The average height of aspen, of young aspen in Yellowstone during the decades when wolves were absent was 50 centimeters. That's the average height. They couldn't get any higher. 50 centimeters. All the studies show that's as high as they got. When wolves were absent, elk were in charge, and they were controlling plant communities. With wolves present, having, we think, a significant impact or strong effect on elk, mediating both behavior and density, elk no longer are in charge of what's happening to plant communities. At least we would suggest this as a hypothesis, that something different then may happen, and maybe it's possible that these plant communities can begin to recover. So the experiment in Yellowstone is one of, we took the large predator out of the ecosystem for 7 decades, and then something very interesting happened. We put it back again and asked the question, what's happening? So if a trophic cascade has reestablished itself with the return of wolves, will Yellowstone's riparian plant communities begin to recover? And we can look at several key species here, and we'll just very briefly look at cottonwoods, willows, and aspen. Cottonwoods, and I'm going to do some pictorial stuff, but we'll look at some graphs. We can go into this as deep as we want, perhaps. But here's a picture of cottonwoods, 1993, along Butte Creek. These are young cottonwoods. These are old cottonwoods, no intermediate size classes. These young ones, by the way, are probably 20 years old or older. They're just heavily browsed. They're in a very heavily hedged condition. They're not going anywhere, okay? Wolves are now present in the park for 14 years. We now have 4 to 5 meter tall cottonwood growing here. There's an individual standing there for scale. Something dramatically has changed. Cottonwood suppression for 7 decades. Now cottonwood are beginning to recover. We recently did a study where we looked at 2 portions of the main Lamar Valley, and if you've ever been there, this is this broad, expansive valley, and we broke it into a portion above Soda Butte Creek confluence and the big valley portion down below. Above the confluence, we are seeing recovery of cottonwood, willow, and alder, and other plants in here. In this picture, there's still a lot of bare gravel up in there, but you can see plant communities beginning to respond. These are old cottonwoods. This is the new cohorts coming in. These are the old cottonwoods here. This is the new age classes coming in here. This goes to 380. These are trees 5 centimeters in diameter or greater. It stops at 2009. If we actually go to 2012, we have thousands actually of cottonwoods that exceed this 5 centimeter diameter class. So we're seeing really an explosion of vegetation beginning to occur up here. For summer, and elk are are now avoiding the Lamar Valley big time, both places. So why the differential? The differential now is due to another large herbivore in the system, and it happens to be bison. Bison seem to like this big open valley. They don't seem to like this nearly as much, and we're getting a response here. We're getting no release down here. The few cottonwoods that we are seeing here, the half a dozen, the handful, yeah, they're greater than 5 centimeters in diameter, but they are being rubbed by bison, and they are not going to make it. They're toast. So essentially, this is going to remain 0 for a long time. So look at the incredible differences in responses that are taking place in the landscape. If you wanted to go to Yellowstone and say wolves make no difference at all to what's happening, I'd take you right to the Lamar Valley and say, look at here, nothing changed. Nothing has changed. A large herbivore is still in charge. If I wanted to see something that is happening and relate it to what's going on, up above here, we think something's happening. Well, let's wander around some other places. Let's go to Soda Butte floodplain, 1997. Wolves have been in the park for 2 years. It's still this grassy-looking meadow. 2013, 4 meter tall willows. We also have aspen in the back coming in here, and these are old cottonwoods there, though. I walked across this floodplain in 1996. There were young willows everywhere, and they were about this tall. And they had grown up that summer, and in the fall they get chomped back down again, and they would grow up and get chomped back down. If you ran your fingers down those willows and you got to the base, you would end up with a very thick plant at the base. These were very old willows. They just couldn't go anywhere. Since wolves are back, they have been able to grow above the browse level of elk. Okay, something has changed. Another example of willows, this is a little bit dark, but it's our only spring-to-spring comparison that we have. We don't have many. It's interesting how few pictures there are sometimes of these places. But this is Blackdale Deer Creek. The willow that stands out for me is this guy right here. Notice it's heavily hedged. They're all actually pretty heavily hedged, these down here too. But here's this guy right here. Here it is over here. 1996, spring of 2008. You can see the changes taking place, okay? Browsing is dropping off on this site. And if we walked out there this summer, I was there this summer, this is what it looks like this summer, okay? If streams in the American West look like this, I'd be a happy camper, you know? But unfortunately, we have too many inside parks and outside parks on public lands that look like this, or worse. And we saw some pictures that Carol showed the other day how worse actually looks and how improvements could actually occur. So this is what we have in many places. This ultimately represents an ecological target of recovery. What about aspen? Aspen's the iconic species. That's the one that gets lots of press, okay? And keep in mind the context. That is, during 7 decades of wolf absence, browsing was keeping these plants in suppression. Not only was it keeping these plants in suppression, all the understory shrub species disappeared, probably tall forbs have disappeared, flowers have disappeared. All kinds of plants that we really don't understand may have disappeared during that period. If we walked out to Yellowstone today, I could wander you around and we can see stands in various stages of recovery or non-recovery. We will still see a fair number of stands that look like this in Yellowstone today. Wolves have been back 2 decades. Not everything is recovering, okay? They're still suppressed. Here's a stand where the aspen are probably waist high. This is good news. Anytime aspen get waist high, chest high, they're on their way up, and they're gonna make it. Everything we've measured says once they start, they're on their way. This is an aspen stand up here. It's about 4 meters tall, and the overstory is gone. It's already lost its overstory, but now recovery is underway. It's a thicket, and it will continue to grow. This is a stand that's in excess of 5 meters. Bill Ripple is standing right there. You get scale. You see the overstory that's left. This is a picture of a couple years ago. That overstory today is entirely gone. It is dead and on the ground. So had wolves not come into the system, these overstory stands were on their way out with nothing to replace them. A little bit of data just to keep you happy. Browsing rates and heights of the 5 tallest young aspen. So why would we pick the 5 tallest? Because we were seeing things beginning to happen. Not the entire clone was beginning to increase in height, the young ones, but some were starting to poke their heads up. So we said, well, let's look at the 5 tallest and see what's going on, because we know nothing was going up before. So we wandered across 98 aspen stands in the eastern portion of Northern Range, and we collected data on them, and we separated them out by riparian and uplands. Here's riparian, here's uplands, and I wanted to really look at the colored dots right up here. Here's browsing at 100% in 2000, 99, 2000, and notice it begins to drop off, and then it takes a pretty precipitous drop here. Notice what happens to heights of those riparian aspen. They're down here in less than the 50 centimeter range, and then they begin to incrementally come up. And they now, on average, on these stands are in excess of 200 centimeters. 200 centimeters, that's the magic height. They are no longer being browsed by elk. They're on their way. So we're seeing great success here. But if we look at the upland stands, let's go to the open circles up on top here, we see, well, browsing maybe has dropped a little bit, but I'm not even sure that's statistically significant. And if we come down here, we find that these plants are not doing much either. They're still not over 50 centimeters, mostly. So in some of our upland stands, and why did we pick these areas? We picked riparian areas, and we picked adjacent uplands to do a contrasting process study to ask what's going on differentially. These plants were right next to each other. There were no differences in elk densities in these areas. These plant communities were right next to each other. But we saw these incredible differences coupled into the browsing signature. So the browsing signature is what differentiates these. So that was an old study. Let me back up here a second. We also, this was data collected in 2006, or went to 2006. We collected actually in 2008. So any studies that were done around 2004 or so would show really nothing going on with regard to the average aspen height. And there was a study that was done in 2004, published in 2010, and asked the question, are wolves recovering Yellowstone's aspen? And he said essentially no, they weren't. And I would agree that the data that was presented in that paper said no, there was no recovery in Yellowstone's aspen because they were measuring the average aspen, young aspen, and they were measuring primarily in upland stands. And look at, this is a period right in here when not much is going on. So that was fine. But the question is, were wolves recovering Yellowstone aspen is just beginning to crop into the picture, show up. We have since went back and remeasured these stands in 2010, And indeed, these curves just continue upward, and these curves up here continue downward. So the trends you're looking at here, push them forward 4 years, and they continue. There's been a more recent study by Luke Painter out of Oregon State. He looked at 87 aspen stands across the northern range. Now, he randomly sampled across the northern range, whereas that previous study was located primarily in the eastern portion of it. Now we're looking at across the northern range and seeing what's going on. His data show a 100% browse here, and then a general downward trend in browsing taking place, and notice a general upward trend in young aspen across the northern range. So there's a start of something going on, which is now range-wide. If we look at another portion of what he was doing, and we can see that it's a patchy release, it's not occurring in every aspen stand. If you look at stands with saplings greater than 200 centimeters, so how many stands have a single sapling greater than 200 centimeters, this magic height? Well, here's the curve up here. One sapling is this curve right here. So today, roughly 45%, today being 2012, 2 years ago, 45% of Yellowstone's northern range aspen stands finally had one sapling greater than 2 meters. That's a big deal. That's a plant that may ultimately succeed and become a mature tree. 25% of stands had stems with 5 or more saplings greater than 2 meters tall, 200 centimeters. This is a really big deal, okay? And look at the trends. The trends are recent, and the trends are associated with a downturn in herbivory. So Beyer had it figured out early on. Hawthorne Beyer did a master's student up there. He was looking at willow growth rings, and in his particular study identified indeed what he thought was a trophic cascade taking place. But he says the inverse relationship between browsing intensity and stem growth is central to trophic cascade hypotheses, as it establishes the mechanism by which a trophic cascade occurs. Browsing, understanding browsing is crucial to understanding plant responses, because this here is not climate. This is not growing season, whatever. This is not increased precipitation. This is not snowfall. This is a change in browsing taking place and allowing that to occur. So when we look at trophic cascades, this idea that animals at the top of the trophic, at the upper trophic level can impact another animal below it and impact plants in an ecosystem, we end up with two major components. One is this thing called a behavioral mediation, a BMTC, behaviorally mediated trophic cascade, which involves things like changes in foraging behavior, changes in vigilance, spatial distribution on the landscape. Studies have shown that these things are going on in Yellowstone today. We also know that wolves can influence the size of a prey population. In fact, it's the thing we almost always go to immediately. How many elk are wolves killing? What's the prey population doing? It seems like that's the first question out of our mouths, when this up here may be just as important. Now, figuring out the relative proportion of these two and how they're operating in time and in space is a really difficult scientific question. So, and I don't want to minimize the difficulty of it. It's a big deal trying to figure that out. So the scientific community is going to have a lot to chew on right here. And Doug Smith kind of probably said it the best. He said the story in Yellowstone is seductive, as it is one of the few examples in today's world of something getting better in nature. Okay, so I'm giving you the seductive story this morning. I'm trying to bring you down this chosen path. But he also says it's hotly debated. It's debated because understanding how ecosystems function and organized is one of the holiest of grails in all ecology. Okay, so all I'm going to say to you is expect more diversity of viewpoints coming out of Yellowstone, but there are, we do see things happening in a systematic way. And then maybe this is a little bit of my parting thoughts story here. This is a graph that showed up in Science magazine. It was an article talking about large carnivores around the world, including lions and cheetahs and pumas and wolves. And this diagram happens to be a diagram built on research that has taken place in Yellowstone basically in the last 10 years, roughly in the last decade, a little bit longer than that, okay? So it showed up in Science, 2014, and I've already taken you down this pathway. Wolves may change the behavior, density of elk, and thereby plant communities may recover. But the implications are more than just aspen, elk, more than just aspen, cottonwoods, and willows. because we know this has implications for all kinds of other things that are going on in the ecosystem. Aquatic ecosystems in riparian areas depend upon what's going on here. Channel morphology depends upon what's going on here. The potential for recovering beaver depends upon what's happening here. Beaver were gone for decades in the northern range of Yellowstone National Park. They are back in the system. They are on an increasing population scenario right now. Birds are now increasing in numbers. Their habitat's improving. Berry-producing shrubs are doing better, maybe for the first time in 7 decades. We are seeing them. And so we're seeing these ecological spin-offs taking place since the presence of this apex predator. Dead elk provide meat for scavengers, also provide carrion for bears, particularly in the fall when they're trying to put on fat reserves. We have some other sidebars going on here. That is, berry production improves. That also is good for bears. So again, the insertion of this predator begins to shift everything down here, or apparently has. It also has potential to impact mesopredator populations, which then may influence what's happening with pronghorn. So the food webs here get pretty complicated, but get very interesting. And it's interesting to ask the question, the very simple question, what difference does it make in the American West if we have removed this apex predator? And then what difference does it make if we put it back? The Yellowstone story captured, again, National Geographic, ends up in this kind of a cartoon, and it's a decision society, in essence, made. At one point in time, we made this decision. We wanted a land without wolves. And we ended up with large numbers of elk, sometimes starving, a story that isn't often told, but they would often starve during bad winters, eroding stream banks, no riparian vegetation, aspen on their way out, and precious little food web support for anything else. With wolves, we end up with amphibians potentially doing better, waterfowl, beaver, bears can do better. Habitat is going to get better for elk through time. Scavengers and bird populations are all potentially doing better. So it's a choice. It really is a choice that society has made. So the question, my parting thought here then, is this right here. Will the ecological benefits of wolves, as observed in Yellowstone, and I stuck in here, and Canadian national parks, because Yellowstone isn't the only place people are looking at what happens when wolves came back. Jasper and in Banff, and they are seeing recovery of plant communities also. Will it also occur in managed landscapes of the American West? And I don't have an answer for that one. And it all depends, I think, upon how willing we are to live with this apex predator. And this apex predator, the curves I show here, Yellowstone is just a small part of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem where there are wolves. Idaho, their range has expanded greatly since their reintroduction. We have wolves fully protected in Oregon in the northeast corner. We have a mating pair, which some of you may know by the name of Journey, down here in this part of the state. And Washington is seeing an expansion of wolves there too. So it's a question, this is a question for society. It's also a question for wildlife managers. How willing are you to live with an ecologically effective density of an apex predator back on public lands in the American West, or on the landscapes in their entirety in the American West? And so there's lots of research opportunities, there's lots of practical questions that need to be answered, but this is something coming down the road for all of us, and this is where things are at today. So there we are, an overview, and I thank you very much, and be willing to take questions if we have time.
Do we have time for 2 brief questions?
And 2 brief answers.
Bob, pick your question.
Yeah, go.
How difficult is it for the Park Service to manage the wolves? I mean, in terms of numbers and wolves getting outside the park?
They don't manage them in a sense of trying. The question is, how difficult is it for the Park Service to manage the wolves? Basically, the wolves are running free. They do what they want to do. If they go out of the park, they get shot. Okay? So the management is done by somebody else. If you consider management as killing the animals, that's how it's done. It isn't done by the Park Service. They let them go. So, yeah. Yeah.
Great story. I wondered if you could share with the audience here what your sampling design was, because at one point you made reference to, if you wanted to show that the wolves weren't having an effect, and the decreased numbers weren't having an effect, you go to this site.
Well, the inferences for the park are the data set by Luke Painter. He collected data from a random sample of 87 aspen stands across the northern range, okay? But he did look at the 5 tallest in each stand, okay? So the 5 tallest are doing the best. If you ask the question, what is the average young aspen doing in that stand, they're gonna be doing less than that, okay? In some cases, the herbivory still is quite large. Whoa, I just had. But here's what we're seeing. When we see 1 aspen get to 2 meters, when we see 5 get to 2 meters, we see more coming along the way, okay? So we could go measure the other 80% of the young aspen, and we would find out that maybe they're not doing much, but we're missing the signature. The signature is something different has happened in Yellowstone National Park. And that something different now is aspen is beginning to recruit, and it hasn't done for 7 decades. It isn't everywhere, it isn't uniformly in every stand, but it is underway. So as representative, here's a stand right here. Okay. This is happening in Yellowstone. If we went in, we'd be measuring the 5 tallest and looking for what's going on. But look at what's happening for the rest of them. The 5 tallest may be 2 meters. The average here may be 3/4 of a meter. Okay, which number do you want? We're trying to get at process. We're asking process. We're not asking, what does the average little aspen stem look like? Okay, so there's a big difference. So this is why one of the studies that was done in 2004 went out there and measured the average aspen out there and said nothing's happening and came to the conclusion wolves are not saving Yellowstone's aspen. I couldn't disagree more. Could not disagree more. But that data set was fine when it was taken. It just got published way too late in the process. Okay.
Well, let's thank Bob very briefly.